There's a rumor going around that U.S. persons have an almost impossible time opening bank accounts overseas. Today I'm going to give you 4 tips that will show why that's not true. So this idea that Americans can't open bank accounts overseas started when, under the Obama administration, a law was jammed into a bill that made its way through Congress called the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, basically making every foreign financial institution like banks and brokerages all around the world the unpaid tattletale of the U.S. government. Banks had to basically phone home any Americans who had bank accounts in their institution or else face huge fines, basically be shut out of the U.S. financial system. And so a lot of banks in well-known jurisdictions like Switzerland were like, I'm doing all right. I don't need these Americans. Let's just get rid of them. Let's shut them out. And so not only did you have Americans who lived in the United States who were just keeping money overseas for diversification. I'm sure some of them were probably hiding it, but the vast majority we've seen were just legally diversifying their cash overseas. They were shut out of the system. But beyond that, people who lived in countries like Switzerland were shut out of the system. Suddenly, 11-year-old kids couldn't get savings accounts at their local bank. People who had jobs in countries had their mortgages called in. I mean, it was pretty crazy. And all because the United States wanted to basically say, hey, nobody's allowed to hide their money overseas. But that meant that people who wanted to just put their money in foreign bank accounts the way we talk about, legally reporting the money they hold overseas, they were having a lot harder time as well. And I'm going to tell you why you shouldn't allow those instances to convince you that offshore banking isn't for you as an American. If it's your first time here, my name is Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We're a boutique consulting firm that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally reduce your tax burden, protect your assets, and increase your freedom and increase your options overseas. I'm also the host of the biggest and best offshore conference called Nomad Capitalist Live. And so let me give you 4 strategies you can use to get an offshore bank account as an American. The first one is have a residence permit in another country. What I think is whether you're living overseas or whether you're just in the United States and you want to have asset protection, you want to have diversification, having second residence, having a second citizenship is important. Why? Well, it all started about a decade ago when the Obama administration basically drew a line in the sand and said that merely because you want to have options, you should be treated as a criminal, and therefore all these banks around the world shut you out and reduced your options. That's why you want to have other places where you can live. And so if you get a residence permit in another country, you'll generally be allowed to open a bank account, or in many cases be required to open a bank account. So let's say, for example, Malaysia's My Second Home program. You're going to be required to open a bank account and put as much as close to $250,000 US in the bank to get that residence permit. And so if you get a pre-approval for that residence permit, they're going to say, great, move the money in now, and once you can show that that's done and you get your certificate of deposit, bring it in and we'll give you a residence permit. So now you've got a bank account. Oh, and by the way, pretty much every bank's going to let you open up an additional checking account, savings account, whatever for day-to-day expenses. You can usually hold that in Malaysian ringgit, US dollars. Same thing in Thailand. If you want to get a Thai investor's visa, or if you get the Thai elite visa, you're either going to have to, for the purposes of the visa, make a deposit in the bank, or you're going to be able to get a bank account to fund the real estate purchase that you made for the visa, or just because you're a resident, you can get a permit. If you look at the Middle East, you get residence in Dubai, in the UAE, because you've got a company, you get a bank account. Look at Bahrain, for example. They have now a new golden visa program for real estate investors. They've always had a lesser program for investors. One of the requirements for that lesser program has always been you need to keep some money in the bank. And once you have a bank account for the money that's required to be kept, hey, you know what? You want to get a checking account, come in and we'll do that for you. So getting a residence permit in some other country. Now, Latin American countries, generally less interesting for banking, insanely bureaucratic, may have some security risks attached. So I never entirely like to bank merely because I'm living in a country. Someone says, hey, I want to move to Mexico, let me open a bank account. Maybe you can, but I'm not moving $1 million into a bank in Mexico, right? I am simply going to bank for banking's sake, and I'm going to live for living's sake. But Asia, the Middle East, Europe, these are all places. I mean, Portugal's golden visa, for example, you are going to be, especially as an American, required to open a bank account in order to make the investments for your golden visa. And so having a residence permit in a country either allows you to open a bank account because, hey, you're living there, you've been pre-screened, or you're going to actually have to put some money in the bank in order to get that residence permit. Now, if you're not living there for years on end, I've seen a couple of occasions where the bank may close your account, but generally speaking, residence is one way to do it. Is that going to solve your problem necessarily in Switzerland? No. But in the countries that we talk about, it may help you. That's the first thing. The second thing is if you don't have a lot of money and you're just looking to kind of dip a toe into international diversification, you can look at emerging market countries. Now, Asian emerging market countries like Cambodia, where we've talked about before, Cambodia is a dollarized country for all intents and purposes. Bank accounts pay high interest rate on dollars. That's more and more difficult because they do want you to have the residence permit, and the residence permit's a bit more difficult to get. Where I'm increasingly looking is in Eastern Europe. You look at Georgia, you look at Armenia, even Azerbaijan, Turkey if you know where to go. Some of the Balkan countries are more difficult but can be done. That whole region will help you open a bank account. I mean, in some cases, $0 or $1 minimum deposit. If you want priority banking, $10,000, $20,000, $25,000. Sometimes they'll say if you're not a resident, they want $5,000 or $10,000 for the non-priority banking. So the numbers vary, but all those numbers are pretty manageable, right? Now, it's more than you would deposit in your local Chase Bank branch where they just want $100. Again, there are some banks in the Caucasus, for example, where, hey, $1 opens the account. Now, there may be some fees to get a debit card, $10, $20 a year, whatever. There may be some fees for the online banking, but for the account itself, you can put a dollar in. And so these are pretty low balances. You've got decent online banking in many cases. It's the user experience isn't that bad. And if you don't want to keep a lot of money, you're either going to be covered by the deposit insurance in those countries. You know, in Georgia, it's about $5,000. Armenia goes up to about $30,000. But you've got some pretty strong institutions in some of those countries where you could potentially feel comfortable going above those limits and you'd still be okay. The third approach you can take as an American is that there are still offshore banks and app banks that are willing to accept you. So if you look at jurisdictions like Belize, like Dominica, some of the ones in the Caribbean, some of the ones in the Pacific, you will find that these countries are willing to accept you, and you can sometimes often open these accounts remotely, meaning you don't have to go there. The Eastern European ones, you need to go there, or you need to know a good attorney and pay them and have a good relationship with the bank and power of attorney. That's a lot more easy, or more difficult. But in the Caribbean, you know, Belize, for example, there used to be people opening accounts through the mail. Now, are those accounts going to be as high of quality? Well, they're going to be offshore banks that are used to working with people remotely. They're not going to necessarily be, you know, quote unquote, real banks that have normal depositors walking in and out. That may be interesting to you because some of the offshore banks have 100% reserve where they don't make loans and they're just basically making their money off of fees. You're going to pay more money for funds coming in and out, but they're more flexible in terms of you're maintaining an account. And not all of them accept U.S. citizens, but again, in some of the countries that I mentioned, they will. They may charge you a couple $100 a year or $10 a month or $15 a month for maintaining your account because, again, if they don't loan money out, they have to make their money from fees. And they also may charge you a little bit more because you are an American and they've got to comply with FATCA. They've got to report that information to the U.S. government. But nevertheless, you know, Vanuatu and Belize and Dominica, even some of the app banks in countries in Europe, if you don't live in the United States, or even some of the fintech services in Switzerland that will sometimes help you. We've arranged that for some of our clients. And so that's not necessarily offshore, but they are remote opened fintech services as well as those banks in kind of the classic offshore jurisdictions, which I don't necessarily love as much because you're going to pay higher fees because there is a lot more scrutiny, there's a lot more paperwork. But hey, you can get an account, you can put in as little as $1,000 in some of these offshore accounts. And again, know that perhaps they're not making loans in many cases. A lot of the offshore banks on the islands don't take Americans, but there are quite a number that do. And we don't talk about specific bank names, not only as a business matter, but because banks don't really like us to do it. They tend to get upset with us and it ruins the relationship. Now, let's say you've got, you know, more than $5,000, $20,000, $25,000. Let's say you don't want to use a bank that's merely based on an app. Let's say that you want something higher level, perhaps even where you can make investments. There are still banks in the UK, in Switzerland, in Liechtenstein, in Singapore that will take Americans, and other places as well, the Bahamas. There are no Cayman Islands. Again, depending on your residential connections, depending on how much money you can put in, that will open accounts for you, and sometimes without you even going there. I've spoken very highly over the years about Singapore. I think for what you have to deposit, for the quality of the banks in terms of the strength, for the user experience, everything that you get, it's really second to none. But you do need to go to Singapore generally to do that. And as an American, what often happens is you don't get any of the investment features that are built into Singapore bank accounts. You're basically just using a cash account, a six-figure cash account. Multi-currency cash account, which does give you some diversification, both in terms of currency and in terms of the jurisdiction where the funds are held. And you're basically leveling up to one of the strongest banks in the world in Singapore, better than anything you could find in the US, but you're still keeping your money in cash. So Singapore is one option where many of the banks will take Americans on a case-by-case basis. By the way, you call some of these banks. I mean, we've had people say, hey, Andrew, I have half $500 million. I call this bank to give me the runaround. I mean, you have to build relationships, and that's what we do here on our team, is build relationships with these banks. Some of them just can't be helped, quite frankly, but the good ones, you build relationships and you help your clients open accounts. But Singapore is one place. If you look at Europe, some of the high-level jurisdictions will take you. What's interesting about Switzerland is you're going to often negotiate what's the opening deposit, 500,000 francs, 1,000,000 francs, 2,000,000 francs. But what's cool is if you can get an account that accepts Americans. Most banks in Switzerland and Liechtenstein don't. In fact, some won't even accept former U.S. citizens if you renounce. I mean, they're that particular. And in some cases, honestly, they're that snobby. But there are some that are good. There's a very small number, actually. I'm not a huge fan of Swiss and Liechtenstein banks. I think that they're rather overrated. The fees are much higher. I think something like a Singapore is often better for what most Americans are used to, what most Westerners are used to. But if you can get in with one of these good Swiss banks, maybe it's 1,000,000 Swiss francs, 1 million, $1.1 million, you can generally make investments. They have private bankers. I find that the knowledge of these guys on the tax side isn't nearly as good as they promise it to be. I've met with numerous private bankers. Andorra is a jurisdiction that generally doesn't take Americans, but I've met with them. I mean, just not impressed with their knowledge. So you're going to need separate tax counsel in the U.S. and wherever else you may be living or investing. But private bankers, from $500,000 to $1 million on up in those, high-level European jurisdictions. Again, the Bahamas could potentially be an option. Cayman Islands, although they generally want to see some kind of connection to the island. Those could all be places where, if you're willing to put in large sums of money, they would be willing to open an account. And again, you don't always have to go there. So if you don't have to go there, the paperwork burden is higher, the scrutiny is higher, oftentimes the fees are higher. So you've got basically getting a residence permit in a country can help you do this. Opening up accounts at up-and-coming countries where, unlike a Switzerland, they want your business. Oh, we got to file some forms with the U.S. government? So be it. We want to bring in capital as much as possible, please. We're trying to grow our business, right? Let's go where you're treated best in countries like Georgia, Armenia, etc. Then you've got kind of the offshore jurisdictions, many of which have moved away from the U.S. Some have reopened with fees, what have you. There's new offshore banks that have come up that are willing to take Americans. There's more, especially in Europe, that are willing to take them if you don't live in the U.S. And then if you're willing to put in $500,000, $1 million, $2 million, you'll see more banks open up. Money does talk. And so, again, lots of Swiss banks, Hong Kong banks. I mean, these are very well capitalized banks. Maybe they don't want Americans under any conditions, but there are plenty of other banks of similar stature that do. And if you want a high-level investment bank, there are some that will work with you.